Natalia paced the length of her modest kitchen in Portland, Oregon, her fingertips brushing the rim of a chipped coffee mug that had long lost its warmth. She still couldn't believe the message from her daughter's school counselor, "Is everything okay at home?" That single question sent a jolt through her spine, one she hadn't been able to shake since. The truth? Nothing was okay. Her 10-year-old son, Lucas, had been unusually quiet lately, his once bright eyes dimmed by something he couldn't express. And now, Natalia finally understood why. Her parents, once the pillars of her small, fragile support system, had quietly begun favoring her younger brother's children, while slowly pushing Lucas to the fringes of the family. The final straw came when Natalia discovered that they had cancelled Lucas's weekend visit because he doesn't really connect with the other kids. What they meant was that Lucas was a reminder of Natalia's mistakes, of her failed marriage, of everything they didn't want to acknowledge. But Lucas was her whole world. Natalia had spent years cleaning up after the emotional mess her family left behind. Swallowing resentment, masking pain, all in the name of peace. But this dismissal of her child, was unforgivable. That night, she sat beside Lucas as he lay curled in bed, his small hand clutching his favorite stuffed dinosaur. "Do you still love Grandma and Grandpa?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Natalia swallowed hard. "I love the idea of them," she said softly, "but not what they did." In that moment, she made a silent vow, no more allowing others to diminish them. No more trying to earn the love of people who treated affection like a currency she could never afford. She called her sister the next day, a cold conversation that confirmed everything she feared. "Honestly, Nat," her sister had said, "Lucas is just different. He makes people uncomfortable." Natalia had hung up mid-sentence. That word, different, reverberated in her bones. Lucas wasn't different. He was gentle, observant, brilliant, and for once, Natalia saw her role not as a peacekeeper, but as a protector. Over the next few weeks, she severed ties slowly, deliberately. She stopped returning her parents' passive-aggressive messages. She didn't show up to family dinners where Lucas was barely acknowledged. And when her mother finally demanded, "So you're really choosing him over your family?" Natalia answered with steel in her voice, "He is my family." What they didn't realize was that Natalia wasn't breaking down, she was breaking free. From their guilt, from their judgment, from their subtle erasures of her and her son. In the quiet aftermath, she and Lucas found peace in the little things: weekend hikes, homemade pizza nights, laughter without tension. Her world had grown smaller. Yes, but also warmer. Brighter. Natalia no longer waited for permission to feel whole. She had built something unshakable with her son. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't asking anyone to accept them. She was demanding it. Natalia shifted in the old armchair by the window, watching her father, once so commanding and full of stories, now struggling to lift the glass of water beside him. It was subtle, the way his hands shook or the way he paused before rising from the couch. But Natalia noticed. She always noticed. At 74, her father had always prided himself on being independent, a retired firefighter who'd once carried people out of burning buildings with ease. But lately, even a walk from the living room to the kitchen left him breathless. The decline wasn't dramatic, not yet, but it was steady. It was in the way he gripped the armrest before standing, the way he asked her to repeat things more often. Natalia had read enough about aging to know the signs. And though her father dismissed them with a forced laugh or an, "I'm just tired," she knew better. She remembered how just a few weeks ago, he'd tripped over the edge of the rug and brushed it off like it was nothing. But the hesitation in his eyes when she rushed over to help, that split-second flicker of vulnerability, said everything. He was starting to lose control of his own body. And it terrified him. "Dad," she said gently one evening, "why don't we go for a checkup together?" He waved her off with that signature gruffness. But Natalia saw the tremor in his hand as he reached for the TV remote. Her concern wasn't just about the physical signs. It was the way he'd stopped calling his old friends. The way he'd sit in silence for long stretches, staring out the window like he was watching something only he could see. It was the fact that when her younger brother called last week, her father couldn't remember what they'd talked about just hours later. Natalia had always been close with her father. closer than her siblings. Maybe because she was the one who never left. She stayed in town, raised her daughter alone after a messy divorce, and now lived just 10 minutes away from her childhood home. It was her, not her brothers, who brought groceries, who fixed the leaky faucet, who made sure his fridge wasn't just stocked with beer and frozen waffles. She didn't mind, not really. But as she watched the man who'd once stood like a wall against the world now shrink into the cushions of a recliner, something in her heart ached in a way she couldn't name. She started researching cognitive decline, mobility loss, early signs of dementia. She learned that walking speed, hand grip, and even social isolation could be indicators of deeper health issues. And her father, once the life of every barbecue, now barely spoke above a murmur at Sunday dinners. The truth was creeping in like a shadow she couldn't outrun. But Natalia wasn't here just to witness the decline, she was here to soften it. She began taking him on slow morning walks, letting him set the pace. She replaced the heavy dishes in the top cabinets with lighter ones, stocked up on his favorite music, and reintroduced chess nights, even if it meant losing every time. Most importantly, she stopped pretending he was the same man he used to be, and started loving the man he was becoming, quieter, slower, but still her father. In the quiet of that fading autumn, as the leaves turned brittle and gold outside the window, Natalia made peace with the shift. She couldn't stop time, but she could fill it with tenderness. And maybe that was enough. Natalia stood at the threshold of the nursing home. Her coat clutched tightly around her as the sterile scent of disinfectant mixed with the faint aroma of reheated soup drifted toward her. It had been 3 weeks since she'd moved in, an unspoken decision between her and her adult children, cloaked in concern and practicality. They'd meant well, of course. The fall she'd had in her apartment was a wake-up call for everyone. But nothing had prepared her for the emotional freefall that came with surrendering her independence. At 77, Natalia had lived a rich life. She'd taught literature for over 3 decades, traveled through Europe in her 40s, and raised 2 children alone after her husband passed unexpectedly. She'd always been fiercely self-reliant. Moving into the home, even one as clean and comfortable as this, felt like erasing part of herself. The days stretched long here. Meals were served like clockwork. Staff members smiled with mechanical kindness. And residents moved slowly, some with walkers, others pushed in wheelchairs. But what hit Natalia hardest wasn't the physical reality, it was the quiet erasure of autonomy. She was no longer Natalia, the professor, the traveler, the woman who once gave impromptu poetry readings in cafes. Here, she was room 214, one of the many who needed to be checked on, helped, bathed. She quickly realized what no one tells you: the loss of control doesn't come all at once. It seeps in subtly. First, they changed her schedule to better fit staff availability. Then, they gently discouraged her from cooking in the communal kitchen. One morning, she woke up to find her favorite books rearranged on the shelf. To make it safer, the small liberties she once took for granted were now subject to approval. And each concession felt like a theft. Her children visited, at first. Her daughter came with pastries from Natalia's favorite bakery and pictures of the grandkids. Her son brought her favorite brand of tea. But as the weeks passed, the visits grew shorter, less frequent. Just a busy week, they'd say. The kids have soccer. Or, work's been hectic. Natalia would nod, smile, and wave goodbye from the window as they left, her heart folding in on itself. Loneliness settled over her like a second skin. But it wasn't just the isolation that gnawed at her, it was the slow dimming of spirit. Around her, she saw others give in to it. Men and women who had once led vibrant lives now sat blankly in front of televisions, dozing off during movie night or staring out the window for hours. Natalia felt the danger of that numbing, that creeping indifference. She knew if she didn't fight it, she'd dissolve into the same quiet vacancy. So she began to write again. In a battered leather notebook, she scribbled memories, poems, reflections. She struck up conversations with other residents, even those who barely responded. She began hosting Literature Hour in the lounge, reading aloud short stories to anyone willing to listen. Some came for the sound of her voice, others for the companionship. But in those moments, Natalia was alive again. She reclaimed her name, her voice, her place in the world. even within the limits of this new life. The nursing home hadn't broken her, it had revealed her strength. Yes, she mourned what she'd lost. And yes, some days felt unbearably long. But Natalia learned that adaptation was its own kind of defiance. They could take her apartment, her solitude, even her routines, but they couldn't take her essence. Not unless she let them. And she never would. Natalia was 77 when she moved into Rosewood Haven, a quiet nursing home tucked between rolling hills and faded oak trees. She had lived a full life, mother of 3, retired nurse, avid gardener, but none of her years had prepared her for the weight of these beige walls or the echoing silence that trailed behind goodbyes. At first, it was just meant to be temporary. Until you regain your strength, her daughter had said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. But 2 months had passed, and Natalia had come to accept that temporary often meant forever in the language of aging. It was in those long, hushed days that Natalia uncovered truths no one had warned her about, lessons that crept into her bones and bloomed like old roses in winter. The first was loneliness, not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that lingers even when you're surrounded by people. The staff were kind, the residents polite, but there was a hollowness in the air, a quiet grieving for lives once lived fully. Natalia missed laughter, missed chaos, missed the mundane comfort of cooking for herself or digging in her backyard soil. Here, her world was reduced to pill schedules and bingo nights. And yet, in that stillness, a new clarity surfaced. She realized that health, real health, was the greatest currency. Watching her neighbors struggle to stand, to speak, to remember, Natalia began to treasure her working joints, her steady hands, her sharp mind. "I'm lucky," she whispered one morning as she buttoned her own cardigan. "Not everyone here could." And that made her grateful in a way she'd never experienced before. The aches in her knees no longer felt like punishment, they were proof of presence, of still being here. The next lesson came like a slow wave. Material things meant nothing. The photo albums her children brought, the heirloom vase she insisted on keeping, even the neatly folded scarves in her drawer, all of it paled in comparison to a single warm conversation or a walk outside in the sun. Life had quietly shifted from accumulation to essence. Natalia, once obsessed with order and legacy, began to live more simply. She laughed when her tea spilled. She didn't mind mismatched socks. She learned to forgive faster, linger longer, and care less about perfection. She also came to cherish independence. Not just physical, but emotional. For years, she had wrapped her identity in the needs of others, as a mother, a nurse, a friend. But here, she was just Natalia, no titles, no expectations. At first, that frightened her. Who was she without her roles? But soon she saw the freedom in it. She began journaling again, painting small watercolors by her window, humming songs from her youth. She didn't need to be useful to be worthy. She simply needed to be. And then, perhaps the most powerful lesson of all, joy still existed, in the smallest, most unexpected places. In a shared joke with a fellow resident. In the crackle of old records played on Friday afternoons. In the handwritten letters her grandson sent, filled with stick figure drawings and misspelled words. Happiness no longer came in waves of excitement but in quiet ripples of meaning. She didn't chase it, she noticed it. 2 months in, Natalia stood taller, not physically, but within herself. The woman who once feared being forgotten had found a deeper truth. She didn't need to be remembered by many. She just needed to be present with herself. Each day was a page in a new chapter. Quieter perhaps, but no less worthy of being written. In this unexpected place, Natalia wasn't just surviving, she was learning how to live again. Natalia had always been attuned to change, subtle shifts in the seasons. The gentle wilt of her garden's last rose. The way her body moved just a little slower with each passing year. But nothing could have prepared her for the quiet, devastating signs that someone she loved was nearing the end. At 83, she was no stranger to goodbyes. Friends had come and gone. Her husband had passed more than a decade ago, and even her youngest sister had faded into the fog of dementia. Still, when her dear friend Eleanor began to change, Natalia felt the earth tilt under her feet once more. It started with the weight loss. Eleanor, once so proud of her daily tea cakes and buttery scones, Began to skip meals. "I'm just not hungry," she'd say with a half smile, brushing it off. But her cardigan began to hang off her shoulders like it didn't belong to her. Then came the fatigue, where she used to walk the garden path with Natalia every morning. She now opted to stay in bed, claiming she was just tired. "Maybe tomorrow," she would say softly, though tomorrow never seemed to come. The most haunting shift, though, was the way Eleanor seemed to disappear, not physically, but emotionally. Conversations became one-sided, her eyes lost their usual spark. Her laughter grew rare. She withdrew from community events at the care home, stopped calling her daughter, and often stared out the window for hours, lost in thoughts she didn't share. One rainy afternoon, Natalia found her crying over an old photograph. When she asked what was wrong, Eleanor simply replied, "I think I'm getting ready." At first, Natalia resisted the thought. She clung to the belief that Eleanor would bounce back, that a warm meal or a visit from her grandchildren would revive her spirit. But as the weeks passed, Eleanor's body continued to weaken. She began experiencing infections, minor at first, but lingering longer than they should. Her skin bruised easily. Her breathing grew shallow at night. Natalia remembered watching her friend sleep one evening, noticing the pauses between breaths, the labored rise and fall of her chest. It struck her then, this was not just illness. This was transition. That night, Natalia sat alone in her room, reflecting on what she was witnessing. The signs were all there: the dramatic weight loss, the physical exhaustion, the emotional withdrawal, the recurring infections, the disrupted sleep, and now, the changes in breathing. Each symptom, like a quiet toll of a bell, whispered of the inevitable. And though it broke her heart, Natalia knew she had to face the truth with grace and love. So, she changed her role, no longer the cheerleader urging Eleanor to get better. Natalia became her companion in stillness. She held her friend's hand without words. She brought her favorite blanket, played her favorite music softly in the background, and read poetry aloud even when Eleanor's eyes remained closed. She spoke gently, lovingly, reminding Eleanor she was not alone. "You're safe," she'd whisper, and deeply loved. When Eleanor passed in her sleep one quiet morning, Natalia didn't cry, not at first. She simply sat beside her, watching the sun pour in through the curtains, and whispered a prayer of thanks for the years they had shared. It was only later, when folding the blanket they used to share, that the tears came, but they were not bitter. They were soft and reverent, like petals falling from a tree. Natalia had learned that death rarely announces itself with trumpets. It slips in quietly, wearing the face of fatigue, disinterest, and silence. But when you know the signs, you don't have to be afraid. You can choose presence over panic. And perhaps most importantly, you can walk your loved one home with dignity, not despair. Life, especially in our later years, teaches us that endings are not always sudden. Sometimes, they whisper their arrival through subtle signs: the quiet withdrawal of a loved one, their diminishing appetite, the exhaustion that lingers, and the fading joy in their eyes. These are not just symptoms of illness, but markers of transition. It is in these moments that we are reminded of the importance of presence over panic, compassion over control. Rather than resist the inevitable, we are given the sacred opportunity to walk beside someone as they prepare to leave this world, offering love, comfort, and peace in place of fear. For many older adults, who have seen the cycles of life unfold repeatedly, this awareness becomes a gift: the ability to recognize when to let go, when to speak softly, and when simply holding a hand is enough. It's a reminder that life's final chapter deserves just as much grace as its beginning. We cannot always change the outcome, but we can choose how we show up, with patience, dignity, and the unshakable knowledge that love, at the end of all things, is what truly remains.